All right, looks like today we're actually going to get to the scarf joint. I had to take a couple of days off. We went out of town, but I am back now. So what I've done is I've already marked out my 14 degrees. I use I don't even know what these are called, but essentially with a scarf joint, there's a few things online you can look up on how to cut these. Some of them are really confusing. They try to use math and they create equations and stuff. Essentially, if you, I like to take the perspective of logic when I go through all of this, and it makes sense when you kind of look at it and see what you're doing. This is going to be the underside of the neck because it's the prettier side, it's the cleaner side. So when I'm holding it, that'll be the underside of the neck. What we want to do is create an angle for our headstock. And a scarf joint accomplishes that by making a few cuts and then using the surface area from those cuts to change actually how the wood is joined together. So we mark out our 14 degrees, which is this angle, it's 14 degrees off of that. So essentially our headstock is going to come from the back side. And so I figure that's plenty of room for my headstock. So once I cut this out, I'm going to flip this piece over, and this piece will become my new nut on this side. And I'm going to make sure to glue it a little over this line because eventually we're going to come back and run this through a joiner and get a really clean, flat surface here. And we'll get to that in a second. Right now I just need to decide if I'm going to use my bandsaw or if I'm going to use a Japanese saw to cut out my scarf joint. And so I think I'm going to just use a Japanese saw. It's cleaner, it's a little more control. I always end up getting squirrely on a bandsaw. And not every time your glue up is perfectly square either. So this, this face is not square whatsoever. This face is close to flat, but it's not perfect. And each one of these corners isn't really square either. And so as long as I've got a center line and I follow everything, none of that will matter because we're going to use the fretboard to do the final contours on the side of the neck. The tenon, it won't matter because we're going to glue it in place, and by then the bottom will be, that's flush enough for the tenon. And I'll clean it up before I do that. So I think I'm going to use a Japanese saw, just because if that's on my table saw, it's pretty flat. I trust using a Japanese saw a little better. So let's get this out and set it up. So I've scored my lines that I want to follow. Then I'm using the rip edge of this saw. And you just come in at an angle, and as long as you follow those lines, you should get a really clean, really straight cut. So I make sure to stay vertical with this line at the same time that I'm staying lateral with that line. And you just take it easy. And it gives the saw blade some really straight, even contours to follow. Once you get into the piece, as long as you stay true to those lines that you've scored out, and try not to put any, bending in the blade. Now this blade it doesn't have a bar across the top to help keep it straight like a razor saw, but I mean it's really precise. And from this point on, precision is the name of the game. There are so many little things that really require precision in this. Once we start building the neck and attaching the neck to the body and deciding, where the bridge is going to fit and using our scale length. And I'll get to some of that today with cutting this scarf joint out. So see, extremely clean. I don't think I could do it that straight on a bandsaw. But we're going to flip this over, and so this face and this face need to be perfectly flat so that when they marry together like this, we have continuity between our two pinstripes. Our nut is now going to end up here. The fretboard will sit over this and will actually cover this joint. And we'll have a volute right here. So now what we need to do is clean up these sides, these two faces, and then we're going to put in some indexing pins and clamp it up and glue it up. So let me get this set so we can start cleaning up these faces so that we get a really good glue joint. Alright, now that I've got the two faces jointed, see, I leave a little bit of an overhang because we're going to plane that off and bring this surface to square and flush because I put a fretboard on it. So right now the most important piece is making sure that these lines marry the other set of lines. And they're sort of going to act as our center line. And there's a little bit of variation in them, but once we get the volute done, you won't be able to tell. The volute should occur right about here. So I'm going to put in some indexing pins and we'll come back when I set the glue up. The way I drill indexing pins is I get the neck clamped up the way that I like it and make sure everything's good. Once it's clamped, I'll get a bit that's the same circumference as the indexing pin I'm going to use. And then I'm going to put two holes where the truss rod's going to go anyway. So I'm going to go through. I'm going to make sure not to go through all the way through the back of the neck because that could be a problem. But it's nothing that you can't just fill. Right here looks like a good spot. And so I like to hug the left side and the right side so that I get a little bit more strength. So I'm going to come about right there. Just put a small hole through both pieces so that when I come back with that pin, it's going to keep them from sliding. A lot of times when you put glue in place, it slides. And you can avoid that by twisting them in place sort of the way you do with gauge blocks. Never heard of gauge blocks? Look them up, they're really interesting. Yeah, so that's a good spot. Now this one's the one I got to be careful with, so I don't want to go farther than the bit is okay. So I need to stay just shy of where the drill bit has its threads. That'll give me a good depth. So these two indexing pins will be more than enough to hold this thing in place while I glue it. And we can move back on to flattening the body. I never got a chance to flatten the two faces truly, and to be honest, the back was a little too thick. With the cap, it was measuring a little above 2 inches, and so I like to keep it below 2. A regular Stratocaster, a Fender Tele is 1 3/4. It's a little more than that sometimes. I mean, depending on if you get a Mexican Strat or American Strat. The Stratocasters that I've been making are about 1.9 inches, 1.8 inches, so a little more than a regular Stratocaster, but I'll do a contour on the back. It's a little beefier. I like the way the beefier guitars feel. They just feel better in your hands. Okay, so now that I got those pins in place, we can move on to gluing this up and just putting it on the back burner for now. Yeah, just make sure you went all the way through on both sides, and so there we go. So I'm going to glue these two faces, clamp them up, and throw this guy to weight. Oh my god. Alright, so the scarf joint's all glued up. It's been clamped under pressure for a couple of hours. But there's our neck blank. I'll run this across a planer and get this to a really nice flat surface. I'll make sure that this angle follows through to the headstock. Just remember, as you take material off of this side, you're going to move your nut this way, and as you take material off of your headstock, you're going to move your nut this way. I've already marked out how many frets we're going to do, and what our rough length is going to be for the fretboard. And so the fretboard's going to sit about there. I leave a little space before the nut, sort of like Fender does, but I build my necks like Gibson does. There's plenty of space down here for a tenon, and we'll take off about a 3/4 of an inch right here for a heel cap. So we're at plenty of space. I can probably get started on the fretboard. I need to joint one side so that I know that I've got a square, straight side to run my square off of when I cut my slots and draw everything out. And I'll go through in a different episode how I draw out my frets. StuMac has a tool. I do it in millimeters, so it's more precise. And my scale length is 25 inches, which is 635 millimeters exactly. So that's for the neck. I did have a chance to sand the faces of the top and back together. For some reason, these two just don't want to match. I've had a lot of trouble getting these to be really, really flat. I've gotten the seams almost perfect. I'm just going to have to use a lot of clamping pressure, and it'll be fine. And if there are little gaps here and there, they're so small that once you add a finish and stain, they usually get filled, and so you'll never notice it. But it's just really peculiar how I can sand these perfectly flat, and there is still just like a warp to this top. I think it's just a little thin to maintain it's hard to plane flat because it's thin. But the top is sitting at, with the back, 1 3/4, just a little thicker than 1 3/4. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 eighths. So it's perfect. Really good. I'm glad I spent a little extra time and shaved down the body a little bit. So I'm going to get to gluing these up. Let these sit overnight under a lot of pressure, and tomorrow we'll move on to drawing out the fretboard and cutting the fretboard. The truss rod got lost by Amazon, and so I'm waiting for that. I think it's supposed to come tomorrow. If the truss rod comes tomorrow, I'll be able to cut a truss rod channel out of the neck blank and maybe cut out our tenon. But I really want to get this body glued together so that I have time to let it sit. Ooh, gosh. Well, there you go. Telly body is all glued up. I had to pull out some interesting tricks. I don't know why I couldn't get those to fit, but there are 0 gaps in that seam, so it should just be an afterthought. I probably lost 5 pounds sanding. Tomorrow, I should get to start working on the neck. I'll probably have a fretboard video tomorrow. How I line out the fretboard, how you get equal sides, how do you measure out the frets, what kind of scale length do you want, why does that matter, how that scale length incorporates to the entire build process, and we'll use a laser to set out the taper of the neck, and we'll get the bridge out here. It's actually pretty interesting to see how much work goes into detailing a fretboard. So we'll get to that tomorrow. Hopefully this guy, I'll come check on it periodically. It's under a lot of pressure. There were some, just did not want to fit together. But it's fine. It's going to be beautiful. As I was planing it, I got to see some, my sweat dropping on it. and a planed surface is sheared off, so it's as good as, you know, 1,000 grit. And this thing is, the top of this is just so pretty. I cannot wait to get this to a really fine grit and throw some stain on it. It's gonna turn out exactly like I had hoped. So check in tomorrow night if you are interested in how to make a fretboard. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check my page out. Tell your friends. You can friend me on Facebook or Instagram. I've got a public page, and as always, you can go to meekguitars.com if you want to get in touch with me. Ask me any questions. You can leave comments below. But yeah, it looks good. Looks real good. And this body's actually light enough that I didn't even put any. I didn't add any or cut out any holes to lighten it. It probably weighs 6 pounds right now, and I haven't even cut out channels for the pickups and, you know, the control cavity. The neck doesn't weigh that much either. It's this soft maple. Even though it's got a hardness of, you know, close to 600 or 700, which is plenty hard enough to build a neck out of, especially with the Purple Heart trusses that I have going through it. It's going to be real strong, but it's really light. So this guitar is going to have a lot of beefiness, but still be light enough to feel like an ash Telecaster. But it's going to be a, you know, maple. It's pretty interesting.